I come back to that, with what's contentious with what I've said, an ancestral way of eating, fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That empowers the individual, disempowers the corporates, it decentralises buying power, it puts it back to the local farmer, the local community.
Welcome to the Recovery and Transformation Podcast, the show that links personal health with societal well-being. I'm your host, Samir Dosani. I'm an activist, a PhD student, and a health coach based out of Johannesburg, South Africa. This show explores the root causes of disease and talks about how people are recovering and transforming every day. Hi, and welcome to another episode. My guest today is Dr. Gary Fettke. Dr. Fettke is a medical doctor in Australia who's been practicing for more than 40 years. A few years ago, Gary was facing a lawsuit for recommending that his diabetic patients not be given so much sugar. That led him down the rabbit hole of low carb and ancestrally appropriate diets, but it also led him and his wife Belinda to research into the origins of the food guidelines, first in the US and then in Australia, and now around the world. If you've heard Dr. Fettke before, I'd still ask that you pay attention to this interview because we cover ground that may be new for a lot of people, particularly the question of how these guidelines and ways of eating are getting exported to developing countries around the world, and why obesity rates in places like the Pacific Island countries are among the highest in the world. If you like this conversation, please do make sure to leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening. With that, please enjoy my discussion with Dr. Gary Fettke. Dr. Gary Fettke, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure, Samir.
So I wonder if you could tell us, so how long have you been sort of a practicing medical doctor in Tasmania exclusively or around Australia? Tell us about your career.
Around Australia, 40 years. I'm going to think carefully about that, but I've been practicing for a long time. Quite proudly, I was youngest in my medical year, and I was the youngest person to finish their surgical fellowship. So I had that at the age of 29. Most people get it in their 30s. And I was very fortunate that I married my childhood sweetheart, and we're still together right now. 3 children, 2 grandchildren. And I mentioned all that because that's, if you have a solid family base, it allows you to feel confident about doing the right thing. And so I've been a surgeon in northern Tasmania for over 30 odd years. And as an orthopaedic surgeon, we come across more and more lifestyle related conditions, whether or not it's osteoarthritis or it's wear and tear, or obesity related problems. But specifically in my practice, a lot of diabetic complications. And my public hospital appointment involved taking on most of the patients, which a lot of people didn't want to do. So particularly those with diabetic foot ulcers, those with infected joint replacements,
and
those
so
where everything else had gone wrong.
If someone came in with a foot ulcer, you were chopping toes off, that kind of stuff? Is that what you were doing?
Well, ultimately they'd find themselves to my clinic. We'd try and save the foot, do all the local treatments. But where that was an uncommon thing 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, it just became a weekly barrage. And the work that I've actually did in the developing world, particularly in the South Pacific, again, the same scenario, this tsunami of diabetes-related complications, which is a no-win situation in the majority of cases. And you end up starting with trimming off, cleaning an ulcer, then taking a toe off, and then a bit more, another second toe and a third toe, and then a bit of the forefoot, and then right through to below knee amputations. And as time went on, I recognised that that surgery is just band-aiding the problem when the primary problem is poor metabolic health. And the primary problem behind that, particularly with diabetes, is diet. And that diet is when it's too high in sugar and carbohydrates. And effectively, in my practice, when patients would come to me, I'd say, drop your sugar, stop your carbohydrate intake, get your diabetes under control and eat some protein. And I would actually prescribe on the medical chart in patients in hospital for them to have 2 eggs and a piece of cheese. And literally with an avoidance of carbohydrate and a small amount of protein, we're able to start turning around foot ulceration. Not cure, but certainly start turning around that primary problem that they'd come to attend with. So in the process of all that, I started working through this biochemistry and the whole concept. And I still hold Belinda and my daughter responsible because we're in Los Angeles in a layover. And they said, oh, you've got to get on social media and start talking about sugar. Anyway, so I was signed up on Facebook. We launched a website. Within 24 hours, I was targeted by someone who was working with Coca-Cola. The food industry don't like my message because it's different. I'm not a celebrity chef. I'm not in the media. You have an orthopedic surgeon who's sick and tired of chopping limbs off, who's saying actually sugar, carbohydrates, ultra-processed food are to blame. And so I became a target.
I'm a little curious, why you, man? I mean, like, no offense, but Tasmania is hardly, the center of
Absolutely.
Australia. Yeah.
We're a tiny little island state off the bottom end of Australia. And that was the crazy thing. But social media being a powerful tool, my voice was reaching well and truly beyond the local community. And as I reached out and started understanding this and that whole low carbohydrate community, low carb, healthy fat, now, some kind of regards, ketogenic diets, I became part of that. And because of that, my message was getting, along a lot further. Like my Twitter feed now, has 2 million hits a month on it. So it's a significant in the game of preventative health. And as I say, I've got nothing to gain from it. And that message of a surgeon speaking out was gaining more traction and some more notoriety.
Yes.
And then in 2014, I think it's 2014, I was reported to the medical board for the first of 3 occasions, each time by dietitians for giving dietary advice that was outside of my scope of practice. And all I was saying to my patients, stop eating sugar and carbs and get control of your diabetes. When we've tracked all that back and we've gotten hold of the internal memorandums and minutes of meetings of the cereal industry here in Australia, literally the minutes of the meetings were saying cereal sales is down in Australia and New Zealand because of the concepts of low carb and paleo, and these 7 people are to be targeted, and I was the only Australian doctor on that list. So part of me goes, crikey, we're up against the $1 billion boys here. And the other part of me is quite proud about the fact that, there's a saying, I presume, it's worldwide, but Belinda and I are just a couple of mosquitoes in a room. We're not much at all, but it's very hard to go to sleep with mosquitoes buzzing around. So that's what I think all of us speaking up, we might think we're small fry, but if we actually keep buzzing away and keep the same message going that people can return their health by incremental changes, particularly in their diet and getting away from the ultra-processed foods. And that means decentralising away from buying powers. It means taking away money from the processed food industry. And when you do that, particularly in diabetes, you actually take that away from the pharmaceutical industry. You actually de-prescribe, you come off medications, you get better control, you're not part of the ongoing sickness industry. It's empowering for the individual and it's disempowering for the corporates.
I mean, it's certainly been empowering for me as a health coach, not even a doctor, to help people, be able to. I had one client who's been on insulin for 20 years plus, and first time in his life he can remember, waking up without pain, not going to the bathroom, 6-7 times a night, and so on. And this is when we're told that diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. It only gets worse. It never gets better. So, certainly thanks for the role that you played in this bigger debate, because I don't think there would be thousands of people like me out there and millions of patients seeing benefit if it weren't for some of the early adopters like yourself who were really spreading this message.
I'm not alone in this situation of being targeted. People have been targeted for 100 years over trying to raise this, in recent times, it's been, myself here, Tim Noakes in South Africa, Annika Dahlqvist in Sweden. But if we go back, the people have been targeted, by the Coca-Cola and the sugar industry, turn of the last century for trying to get these messages across. But in recent times, it's really important that my case here in Australia was ultimately overturned and Tim's case in South Africa and Annika's as well, because what it means that if you're a health practitioner, you're a medical healthcare professional, doctor, health coach, you can now talk about this. And in Australia, there's been a lot of work done to get this as part of now our national diabetes strategy. You can put your diabetes into remission by adopting a low carbohydrate lifestyle. They also talk about having bariatric surgery as well as also very low calorie drinks, and all of those can put things into remission. But bariatric surgery is very expensive, has a high complication rate. It's for an elite few people, and it's an operation on a normal organ for a lifestyle condition. The very low calorie drinks are commercially available. They're a commercial product. Welcome to the big food industry, tampering again. And it's not sustainable. So, this concept of low carb, healthy fat living, eating whole foods, fresh, local, seasonal, is sustainable and it's achievable.
Yeah.
If you've got the options available, and we can talk about that. I think there are unfortunately wide tracts of society that don't have all those options available. But for those that choose it and have the opportunity to do it, then they can restore their health, and literally overnight. It's been a fabulous experience for me to actually give my patients their health back without operating.
Yeah, amazing stuff. So with that, I wonder if we could go a little bit, because if I think about the discussions that I've had with mainstream nutritionists, which would just be a small fraction of what you've had to experience, but they sort of accuse me. I'm paraphrasing, I'm not exactly quoting, but ultimately it comes down to accusing me of imposing a sort of eating disorder on my clients because I recommend a low carb way of eating. And they say that this is restrictive, and they say that no, you must eat assumably according to the whole guidelines. So what would you say, just playing devil's advocate, what would you say if I were to tell you such a thing?
Well, we don't know each other well enough for me to start swearing, do we?
By all means.
I actually think that the dietary guidelines of the Western communities, because that's pretty well where they've come from, have been a social experiment over the last 50 to 60 years, and they've been an abject failure. So the experiment of the dietary guidelines hasn't worked. There isn't a society in the world that's adopted the dietary guidelines and gotten healthier. We can just see we've seen an explosion of obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, autoimmune disease, cancer. All of those have exploded since the introduction of dietary guidelines. Quite specifically, those Indigenous communities that have adopted Western food, and we're talking whether or not it's our Indigenous communities here in Australia over the last couple of hundred years since the colonialisation, white man coming, and the same thing in Africa, those same things to the Indigenous communities in North America. The introduction of white man food, which is effectively the introduction of carbohydrates, sugars, and most recent times the seed oils, has been associated with a significant deterioration in their health. So wherever we've introduced guidelines, hasn't worked. What's fascinating is where those Western guidelines have come from, particularly the US, which has been largely adopted. And that all comes back to October 23, 1917, which was the formation of the American Dietetics Association. And so that group was formed. They then were giving advice to the US Defense Department and then ultimately into the food guidelines of the world. But the people who were writing that right at the beginning came from the processed food, and particularly the cereal industry. So when you actually go back in time, you find that The person who instigated that was a woman by the name of Lena Cooper. She was the first nutritionist dietitian for the US Defense Department. She wrote the textbooks for the next 30 to 40 years, which actually became the textbooks for all dietetics around the English-speaking world. And her legacy continues on in textbooks nowadays. So I call that generational education. You believe your teacher, you believe your textbooks, and their teachers believe them. So this has been in place for 100 years. So we literally got off to the wrong foot. So when you look into those textbooks, they were in fact vegan, vegetarian. They demonized meat. They were promoting the benefits of cereal and grains and carbohydrate. So you've got to work out where Lena Cooper came from. Now, Lena Cooper was working at that point in time where it was a protege of John Harvey Kellogg, of Kellogg's cornflakes. And Kellogg's cornflakes were actually, the whole cereal industry was started based on a religious ideology rather than actually for health benefit. I mean, it was presumed for health benefits, but it was actually believed. So there's an enormous difference between Western vegetarianism and veganism and Eastern vegetarianism. But the Western vegetarianism, and now we talk about veganism, actually comes, I'm racing through a lot of Belinda's work very quickly here. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been highly influential in determining the dietary guidelines of the Western world. And with that, everyone goes, oh, who's the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Well, they were born out of the temperance movement in the mid-19th century in the US. They largely had work, came around, their beliefs come from Ellen G. White, their prophetess, and strangely enough, her most vivid and most important thing in this whole topic is that she felt that if someone was to masturbate, that was the most evil of all sins, and they'd never go to heaven. So this is a basic ideology, and as a result of that, John Harvey Kellogg was working for the First Family as a child. He was typesetting Ellen G. White's works at the age of 12, seeing that masturbation was the worst sin on the planet. What that meant for us now is that he invented breakfast cereal, Kellogg's cornflakes, to quell our lustful thoughts. Bland food to quell our lustful thoughts. And that flow on then became the cereal industry. He also invented nut analogues, the first meat analogues, which were made from nut butters. That group ended up bringing the soy industry into Western civilization. So with the Adventist group at this point in time effectively started the cereal industry of the world, the soy industry of the world, and the meat analogue industry. So they are now the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. They're highly influential around the world, and particularly in developing nations, where they're trying to push this religious ideology of vegetarian veganism, high carbohydrate, highly processed food upon communities for their salvation. Because ultimately, when the world's population moved towards vegan vegetarianism, then according to their belief, then Christ will return. Now, Belinda and I, we're not anti-religious. Okay, we state this over and over. You can have your beliefs, and you can live by them, and your family and your community, but those beliefs should not be determining the dietary outcome, the dietary guidelines of the world, particularly the Western world, and now influencing into the non-Western world, because they're not based on science, they're based on a religious belief, they're not based on biochemistry, they're not based on health outcomes, they're based on a belief that the Garden of Eden diet, fruits, nuts and seeds, is God's given diet. So the Garden of Eden diet that they believe in doesn't actually even include vegetables. That only got introduced later in the piece. But the trouble is this group has effectively been writing the dietary guidelines since 1917. And then that's become, so your dietitians, your nutritionists, don't even realise that their textbooks are vegan vegetarian. The Australian textbooks, we've gone through them, actually barely have the word meat in them. Talks about protein. Even the My Plate in the US now can't even bring itself to say meat. It just has protein in one quadrant. So this whole, it's so insipid, but it's been crafted into our culture for 100 years. So the poor dietitian who's giving you a hard time doesn't realise where her education's come from. So my education as a doctor has been corrupted as well. The Flexner Report in 1910, commissioned by Carnegie of oil and Rockefeller of steel, that literally came, they got rid of holistic health. And so we got rid of preventative health. We keep talking about preventative health measures, but effectively we had the pharmaceutical industry born 100 years ago, and now it's much easier in our education is to medicate people rather than to prevent disease. Diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. That's what's been instilled in everyone's belief, that you're just going to be going to more and more medication, more and more insulin, when simply taking away the ultra-processed food, particularly the refined carbohydrates, bang, you can put it into remission and come off drugs. Incredibly powerful tool for the individual, but costing a lot of money to a sickness industry, the food industry, pharmaceutical.
Yeah. Gary, this is something that I haven't heard you talk about before. So you're mentioning the Rockefeller-Carnegie report. Just tell me a little bit more about that report.
Yeah, that was 1910. Abraham Flexner was the one commissioned to do the report. And again, it's all there in history. It's fascinating with history. And we can actually go back to ancestral diets and down the track. But at that time, the Flexner report was commissioned in the US and Canada. And Abraham Flexner went around and looked at all these different medical schools and effectively closed 50 of them, which were more holistic. Following on from that report, if those medical schools adopted the report and started to, this more medicating and operating concept, then Rockefeller and Carnegie supported those institutions with the building of bigger medical schools, research facilities. So you can go around a lot of the US universities and see the amount of money that Rockefeller and Carnegie put into those institutions, which cemented the model of education in place, of which we're still paying the price today.
So
because that's become the Western influence on medical guidelines.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that this kind of the sick care industry, as we talk about it, or people, the doctors have one tool and it's the prescription pad. This kind of model that we talk about in medicine, there was a time when that model may not have cemented itself, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's so entrenched now. I mean, we're trying to actually put this low carb concept into our education facilities right now. It's been adopted by, as I say, the National Diabetes Strategy, so that we can actually say this is a powerful tool. But you try and get this into the education system in the universities, and we come up against the same old barriers. And when you look into those barriers, we find that the universities have significant fundings, both personal to senior heads and academics in the in those universities, but also the universities themselves in research funding. Hundreds of thousands of dollars going to academics, millions of dollars going into research to keep the status quo, to keep everything going as it is.
Wow.
And again, so that's where you just simply follow the money. The system doesn't want to change and empower the individual. The Adventist Church, I don't think they're vindictive. I don't think they're nasty people. I think they're actually well-intentioned. They believe in their product. They believe that this is going to be the pathway forward for salvation and health. But the trouble is they're actually not as healthy as they keep telling us that they are. So they quote figures that they keep studying themselves. But the Adventist health studies are completely flawed, because they were done literally, the whole Adventist health studies, which are quoted over and over as being beneficial for vegetarianism and longevity and health. That whole process was started by a fellow by the name of Harry China Miller. He was an American, but he's named China because he set up a whole lot of institutions. And soy industries in China then brought that concept back to the US and to get it into infant feed and to baby formulas. But he came back to the US to set up research to prove the visions of Ellen G. White. And the scientific method is to disprove the paradigm. If you get an email from me, it says at the bottom, science evolves by being challenged, not by being followed. That's the scientific method. Challenge, challenge, challenge. Because the moment you disprove it, the black swan. Everyone thought in the world, white swans were the only way until they found black one. One black swan disproved everything. So the same thing. But what happened here is we've actually got one religious group which has set up research which has been repeated over and over and over as being proof, but it was flawed from the outset to prove that Ellen G. White's visions were correct. When you delve into that, you actually find that their definition of veganism is to not have meat more than once a month, and vegetarianism to not have meat more than once a week. Well, that's not the one in popular media. So they're cheating in their own studies. And we understand Ellen G. White was probably still eating meat in her 70s. So, preaching one thing, doing another. We've heard that, that happens in every culture, doesn't it? The leadership preaches one thing. And, that sort of leads on to another historical topic of whoever controls the protein controls the people. So I talk about the difference between animal-based foods and then plant-based foods. So an animal-based food has a complete protein profile, essential proteins, has a complete healthy fat profile. It contains micronutrients and minerals in the right proportions, because we're all just animals as human beings. And plant-based foods have an incomplete protein profile. They have an incomplete fat profile. They have poor bioavailability, have poor nutrients, poor minerals, poor micronutrients. So if you're going to have a plant-based diet, it has to be supplemented and carefully supplemented. And so, but historically, societies recognise that we've had the royalty have crown land. So they can hunt and keep their animal protein and healthy, complete animal profile coming through nutritionally, and the commoners were given the commons to cultivate for the grains. And I think there's that classic quote by Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." And I think it sums it a whole lot up there. That said, literally, if you're the upper class and the royalty, then you have the ability to get good food, and the lower classes don't. And as a result, if you control that protein, now we're actually seeing that now playing out with this whole push towards plant-based proteins, pea proteins, soy proteins. Huge monocultures stripping our soil of the nutrients. But nonetheless, those proteins are incomplete, but they have the advantage of shelf life, transportability, and profit. So we've got this enormous marketing campaign out there saying you should be plant-based, plant-based, and plant-based. Well, it's not based on science. It's not based on the biochemistry. It's based on someone's profitability.
Yeah.
And it's not you as the consumer. It's not profitable for you as a consumer because you're going to end up sick.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Gary, I want to... sorry.
Yeah, so if you can control the guidelines and control the rhetoric around it, and control the education of the medical student the nurse, the health coach, and whatever. And the poor dietitians don't even realise they've been conned.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's very confronting to find out your textbooks were wrong.
Yeah, no, it's true enough. I want to ask you something, because I used to live in Australia, but a long time ago in the late 90s. I lived for a couple of years. I did my master's at a place called La Trobe University outside of Melbourne. And at the time, I happened to have been a vegetarian. In fact, I was pretty much vegan at that time. And it wasn't easy for me to live as a vegetarian or a vegan in Australia. And I couldn't imagine this ideology taking hold in the way that you describe in Australia. So have things changed really that much since I've been there? Is it common to find vegetarians in Australia now, or is it still?
Oh, a lot of people saying they are.
Yeah.
We look at food consumption, and it's probably not, but it's being really pushed as an educational aspect. So I look at our children, I look at our grandchildren's lunchbox, what's recommended at school. I look at functions. There is, like I was at a function the other day, and there's a clear vegetarian table. In 1990s, that wouldn't have existed. So this political correctness of having the vegan vegetarian option available. It's still only a small percentage, but it's now. There's this push, particularly in the younger people, and we've got our kids, and one's in her 20s, and she finds that when she's out and about, it's harder to eat meat because of everyone else giving her a bit of a hard time. Not everyone, but it's this passive aggression against you eating too much meat. We have the media talking about meatless Mondays. I just heard that the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists here in Australia are having a meeting, and they're going to have a meatless day. Why? Why are we promoting this ill health? Because it's not based on science. It's not based on health outcomes. It's based on perceptions and a media that keep spreading a message of fear, repeating it, and controlling that message going out. And the only people who've got the power to keep doing that is people with a lot of money or a lot of belief. And so that I come back to the Seventh-day Adventist group as a whole. They have positioned themselves into very senior positions within the World Health Organization, United Nations, advisory bodies. In most Western countries, half a dozen of the prime ministers and presidents of Polynesian countries are now Seventh-day Adventists, all trying to move this Western highly processed dietary guideline into their communities. And most of those indigenous communities are highly insulin resistant. They're already struggling with obesity and diabetes. The 10 top countries for obesity in the world are the Polynesian islands. Every country I hear says, we've got the highest obesity rates in the world. I'm sorry, you don't. It's actually the Polynesian countries in the Blue Pacific are ranked 1 to 10. And they take up numbers 1 to 9 for diabetes. And Kuwait comes in at number 10 there. And why is Kuwait in there at number 10?
I have my theories, but what's your theory?
They don't drink alcohol.
A lot of Coca-Cola.
So they have lots of sugar. They have lots of sugar-sweetened beverages.
Yeah, I mean, that would imply that drinking alcohol is a healthier option, which I don't think is what we mean. But it's something. Yeah, it's something. Maybe something related to that. Yeah. I mean, I think in general, if you spend time in the Middle East, there's just a lot of sugar everywhere.
You're right. There's a lot of sugar there, but they have. I think what's happening is countries around the world have this perception that eating a standard American, a standard Australian diet, these dietary guidelines, is a healthier option because it's come with the healthy message. It's just an abject failure. I've got my personal story. As I didn't eat particularly well in my 40s. I thought I'd try and eat better. I thought I'd go and eat by the dietary guidelines, and all I did was put on weight. Then I was trying to outrun my bad diet. And now I don't, if In Australia here, you can actually assess whether or not you're eating healthy or not. It's one of these healthy Australian guideline websites. And I score, I think, 23 out of 100. I'm a complete failure because I'm not eating the dietary guidelines. But I'm infinitely healthier, metabolically healthier, by doing exactly what they're telling me not to do. As are many people now.
For sure. I'm definitely one of them as well. I shudder to think what I'd score on that chart, but maybe I'll do it just out of curiosity. Let's go back to the countries you're talking about. So the South Pacific, we are talking about countries like the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Tuvalu. Am I in the right part of the world?
Yeah, Vanuatu. Papua New Guinea.
PNG, okay. And the last I checked, which admittedly, I used to have a job where I was the head of the Asia Pacific, department for this NGO. And I looked up some nutrition statistics. I'm talking about a good 20 years ago, I would say. And there was hardly, at least there wasn't measured obesity. Some of those countries, there wasn't much good data at that point in time. But the countries that had data, the obesity rates were very, very less at that time. So what you're describing is that in 20 years, it's skyrocketed and now suddenly the number one. What is behind that? How has that happened?
Oh, it's Western processed food. It's cheaper to buy a soft drink in Vanuatu than it is to drink water or milk. The staples are now rice and cereals and grains rather than their local food. You can go to their markets, and so I've done my foreign aid work there for several years, and you go to the markets, and the markets have got good food in them. But the supermarket 50 metres away is just selling these huge bags of highly polished, highly refined rice, which becomes a staple. And it traditionally, my understanding of Asian cultures is you have a small amount of rice with your meats and your vegetables as available. But you weren't having the major component of that meal being a highly refined rice. The traditional rices had, the husks involved had more fibre, and it would slow the glycemic index down. I'm not saying. I still think rice is as macronutrient, it's high amounts of carbohydrate, not a lot of nutrition in it. But what they've done is they've moved towards having less of their local foods and more of this highly processed stuff, which comes coming in cheaper. Significant amounts of cooking oils in what I call industrial seed oils now, rather than cooking in their traditional ghees and butters. And it's literally, with the introduction of this Western diet, all of these countries have seen the introduction of Western disease. And this has been well documented, whether or not it was in Africa, or whether or not it's been... Well, you've probably heard of Weston Price's work.
Of course.
Weston A. Price. And he again, we go back 100 years, and he looked at indigenous cultures all around the world and found them to be healthy, lean. As a dentist, he was looking at their dentition in particular. But he noted those cultures that were eating a traditional diet based on their environment were healthy and well, without the cardiovascular, cancer, and metabolic diseases we see now. Introduce Western diet, and there isn't a culture in the world that hasn't gone backwards with the introduction of this highly processed food.
Yeah. The rice is interesting.
There might be, but I haven't found it yet. I'm just,
Yeah, fair enough. The rice is interesting. I mean, I remember conversations that I used to have. In those days, I'm talking about PNG. So we had some people from PNG, and they really, they were swimming upstream in that they hated rice. They had this whole thing about how rice is a foreign, it's being brought by guest workers and so on who are working in the mines. Not that there's anything wrong with those people coming and working, that's fine. But our traditional starch, our traditional food is these, I didn't like them at all, but they found them very delicious, these kind of tough tubers that they would cook a certain way and so on. And they had many, many, many different varieties of these tubers. And that was their traditional food together with lean meats. And I think if you're going to have carbohydrates in your diet, or a lot of carbohydrates in your diet, as maybe they did have in their traditional diet, was based around that tuber, at least in some places. I think a good way to do it is with a lot of lean meats.
I think, well, you may be aware, it's about some years ago I came up with this nutritional model of inflammation and modern disease, where it's a combination of perfect storm, where you have too much sugar, too much refined carbohydrate, and you combine it with the polyunsaturated seed oils. And that creates inflammation, creates oxidation across a whole variety of tissues, the cell membranes, the blood vessel walls, every corner of the body. So I think you can get by with having higher amounts of carbohydrate in your diet, as long as you're not combining that with the seed oils, the vegetable oils. So those cultures, and again, I talk about this from a latitude point of view. The closer you are to the equator, the more sunlight you're exposed to, the higher levels of vitamin D theoretically you have. Vitamin D is critical to the metabolism of the byproducts of sugar and carbohydrate. So if you have high levels of vitamin D, you can get rid of some of that inflammatory material. But if that material becomes oxidized because of the seed oils within it, then it's just a whole lot of extra inflammation. So those traditional cultures, which actually were eating their fish, which would have had good oils in them, they were eating their meats, which would have had healthy fats in them, and they might have been having their tubers and their ground vegetables. They weren't having seed oils. They weren't. They just literally. I mean, if you only got to look at on YouTube and look up, margarine production, and you just see what an industrial complex it is. That I mean, understanding that those vegetable oils were actually initially used as lubricants in our cars and our engines, and they were used for making candles, and they were used for lighting our. So the fact is that as we started finding this thing called electricity and the light globe, and they'd find another use for this stuff, and then it ended up entering our food cycle. Again, this social experiment of the last 60, 70 years. And so say to the dietitians, how on earth did we evolve over the last couple of million years on an ancestral diet with very low rates of cancer, metabolic disease, diabetes, even osteoarthritis? So pre-agricultural revolution, osteoarthritis appears to have been very rare. Post-agricultural revolution, we started seeing that evolution of osteoarthritis. And this is stuff I've put together for a talk called Carbohydrate, the Dose is the Poison. But from an orthopedic point of view, when you look at cartilage damage in a joint, look at tendon damage around joints, you find the end products of glucose metabolism, of carbohydrate intake. You don't find inflammation secondary to trauma or proteins or fats. You find the byproducts of carbohydrate ingestion.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And it is fascinating because I've actually, and there's some great stuff that came out of China in 2020. I keep saying that not everything bad came out of China in 2020. And this research was actually looking at inflammation in osteoarthritis of the knee. And that was actually looking at the effect of insulin on osteoarthritis of the knee. So when the insulin levels went up, the inflammation went up. When the insulin levels went down, the inflammation went down. And I've seen that in a practical sense, say to people with osteoarthritis of the knee, stop eating sugar and carbs. By definition, their insulin levels come down and they lose their pain or have a dramatic improvement of it within days to weeks, and actually before they lose weight. So it's not about weight loss, it's about reducing inflammation. Now, I know that the Chinese missed the boat on that one because literally at the end of it, they said we should be targeting insulin from a pharmacological aspect. We should be trying to make money out of this. When the simplest way to actually reduce insulin levels is don't eat carbohydrate.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Don't eat glucose, therefore your body won't be producing insulin. You can help treat your own inflammation.
In other words, if you're sitting on a nail, maybe don't invest in painkillers. Maybe just stand up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. And I actually think all of this is incredibly simple. I'm just frustrated and angry that we as a health profession are still inflicting this harm on patients.
Yeah. If I can give my own N of one data point, I mean, I thought I had arthritis in my 30s. I remember I had a bum leg. So I'd wake up every morning and there would be severe pain. I'd have to sort of warm myself up a little bit before I could go down the stairs. And I just thought it was normal, part of aging. I was like 36, so I was hardly old. And then the only intervention I made was that I gave up seed oils because I saw your talks and other people like you. And I thought, okay, this is a pretty easy thing to do. Let me throw away all the canola oil and just switch to, at that time it was olive oil, which is probably still oxidized, honestly. And coconut oil.
Olive oil is a bit overrated, but nonetheless, it's better than the other ones.
But the pain went away in a matter of, I can't remember if it was days or weeks, but definitely within a month. I'm now to the point where I can't remember which was my bum leg because there was no bum leg. Does that make sense?
Oh, look, I get it. I mean, I as time's gone on, I was operating on less and less people. I've got a shoulder surgeon colleague who said he booked all of his patients for surgery 6 to 8 weeks away and encouraged them all to go low carb keto. And most of his patients were cancelled 6 to 8 weeks later. And he's in fact stopped operating because he just says this is such a powerful tool, he shouldn't be operating. But not everyone can do it. I understand that. But I've got so many, I know of people who can't do it, so they go along and see one of my colleagues who does the operation and knee replacement, hip replacement. I went, okay, that's all right. But I'm at the point now where I think we're doing so much unnecessary surgery. Like bariatric surgery, as I said before, it's on a normal organ. The preoperative workup on those patients before the 6 weeks before they have surgery is to put them on low carb meals so their liver shrinks. I've had this debate with surgeons. I say, well, if it's good enough for 6 weeks to make the surgery easier and they lose weight and the liver shrinks and turn around their fatty liver disease, why don't you go for another 6 weeks and then another 6 weeks and then another 6 weeks? You won't make any money.
Yeah.
I don't win any friends in my surgical colleagues when I keep saying stop operating.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this because I have a client in Australia who had bariatric surgery, and the problem she had with the recommendation, the keto recommendation, was that she just didn't receive enough support. I mean, there were issues I know, and from working with many people who've made this transition. There is a period of time when one needs to be wary of electrolytes, when one needs to be wary of like fat to protein ratios. There's a period of time when we see the same complaints coming up again and again, so-called keto flu kind of complaints and so on. And if the nutritionist she was working at that time with had no capacity to give her any kind of advice on how to handle that. If they're going to be making that recommendation, I hope that they would at least train themselves on how to deliver it properly.
This is exactly one of Belinda's topics about everyone who undergoes a lifestyle change needs SAM in their life: support, accountability, motivation. And if you've got SAM in your life, you're more likely to get there. I actually think a low carb keto diet is not hard. I think it's actually easy once you understand what we're talking about. And I alluded to this before, I'll say it now. My definition of nutrition dietary guidelines should be one sentence, and this is it. You should eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugars and processed food. Now that's applicable anywhere on the planet. It also takes into account that latitude, because the closer you are to the equator, the more sunlight you're going to have, the vitamin D levels theoretically higher. I know that vitamin D levels are not that high on equatorial populations, and that's partly because we've created fear, and it's partly because pigmentation of the skin. But we've gotten this wrong. So again, that's an ancestral diet. There's no way we evolved without doing that. We didn't have transport miles. We don't have teeth to eat cereals and grains. The very first cultures that started doing that, actually, when you look at their molars and their dentition, their teeth were ground down at the back because they tried to eat grain. The only way you can eat grain is to process it, mill it, grind it, and it gets turned straight into glucose and sugar. I've forgotten the fellow, he's up in Finland. But he was telling us about the very first bread and beer was made before the agricultural revolution. You can go back around 12 to 14,000 years and you find the first introduction or finding of beer. So from an evolutionary aspect, beer and bread actually have no relevance because there's no nutritional gain from eating them. So, in fact, it's probably the very first episodes of a hedonistic pursuit for feeling good. So, you can sort of imagine that there was a pile of grasses and seeds that got a bit of water in them. They fermented up, and then someone drank it, and then all of a sudden felt lightheaded. And I'm going back 14,000 years now. I don't have a camera. It wasn't on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. So it was literally that you can imagine that sort of happened. Still trying to work out how they made the first breads. But literally, to go through that process has no nutritional gain, has no evolutionary benefit to us. It was probably a hedonistic pursuit, the pursuit of pleasure. Whereas we can look at our hunting skills over the last couple of million years. Once we started actually hunting and actually eating animal meats, and particularly marrow, then we had an increase in our brain development. And we can tell that because you can actually look at remains and see ancestrally, not fossils, but ancestral remains where they actually had implements to crack the bone marrow. And then, so they were getting access to that. And with that, we saw an increase in our brain size. It's interesting, in the last 50,000 years, our brain size has come down by about 100 mil. So our brain development, our ability to actually develop into where we are at this point in time was developed on the basis we actually started to learn to hunt and eat animal proteins and fats. Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. Can I give you my quick perspective on that? You may find it interesting or you may find it irrelevant. But I am respectful. I will be interested. Well, it's up to you. But the more I look into this, because I'm finishing a PhD in anthropology at the moment on how to look into some of these questions. The more I look into it, those dates that you mentioned, 12 to 14,000 years ago, what happened in that time frame? We have the extinction of the large megafauna, these mammoths and so on, which is what early humans were preying on for 200,000 years before that, maybe longer, maybe 300,000 years before that, right? That's just Homo sapien. You can go back to Homo erectus, was having very similar behaviors for 1.4 million years or whatever it is, right? So, in other words, what I'm saying is that climate change happened. We don't know exactly why. Some people say it was meteor activity. Some people say there's other things going on. Climate change happened, ended the last ice age. These megafauna went extinct. And then humans had to find a way to survive. Now, because you've been studying this so long, you know that there's a concept called rabbit starvation, where if you eat only protein, you basically will die. You can't survive. Humans need calories in fact, they need a majority of calories either from fat or carbohydrates or some combination of the two. And therefore, my hypothesis, it's nothing more than a hypothesis at this point in time, but we're trying to find more evidence that will at least shed some light on this story. My hypothesis is that in order to deal with the loss of the prey species, humans went through a time of starvation. And in order to deal, coming out of that time of starvation times are also innovation times. There are many different experiments going on. You mentioned the people with molars that are ground down because they're trying to eat improper foods. We have examples of people eating like acorns and all kinds of weird stuff from this time. But coming out of that, you have two things. You have animal domestication, specifically animal domestication for milk, which had never happened before, horses' milk and cow's milk. And milk, of course, is a great source of saturated fat, which is, again, those calories that you may need if you don't have access to fatty animals. And you also have, of course, grain and grain-based civilizations and so on, what will later become, the big, the Indus Valley civilization and so on. So that may be one explanation of why those things happen at the time that they do.
I'm on board with that from a progress as man, and then when we brought cereal and grain production into our livelihood, we also brought with it civilization as we know it. It wasn't just domestication of land; it was domestication of our food production. I remember reading a paper sort of saying that how grain has domesticated humans.
For sure.
You ever heard that flip side?
Yes. Many people have made that statement, somewhat provocatively, but
I recognise it is.
Yeah.
But it came with the bonus that we now have civilization away from our nomadic hunter-gatherer concepts. And the price we've paid for that now, as we've gone further and further down that pathway, is metabolic poor health. I also am aware, when you look at the Indus, but particularly the Roman Empire did poorly with its agricultural practice, and they lost their topsoil. And arguably part of the fall of the Roman Empire was actually because of its poor cropping practices. And we can see that right around the world now. I remember reading a formative book for me. It was Collapse by Jared Diamond, probably 20 odd years ago I read that. There's a great book called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization by Montgomery at the moment. It's been out for a few years. But effectively, if we don't look after our soil, then we don't look after the nutrition of our soil. We don't look after that. It means poor nutrition in our food. It means poor nutrition in our bodies. It means poor metabolic health across the board. And the thing which still concerns me is that the majority of that, our management of the soil, is related to our industrial monocultures on it rather than our ruminant animals. We've only got 4% of the world's land which is arable. We've got 20 to 25%, which is actually grassland, which could be actually nurtured in a different fashion, so we could actually have our ruminants on that sort of agricultural land.
Yeah.
I don't have all the answers because do we have enough food on the planet to feed people? We probably do. We just don't do it very well. Food wastage is so great. What was that figure I read recently? The third greatest producer of greenhouse gases on the planet by country size is actually food waste.
100%.
After China and the US. And the majority of that is plant-based food. It's whatever we're doing, we're not doing it right. I've got my ideas, which the individual can do. And the individual has the choice of what to eat today, what not to eat, whether or not they want to fast and not fast. The problem is, I see our governments and our educational institutions are being manipulated by forces, whether or not it's conscious or subconscious, which are actually stopping this health message going forward. I don't know the answer for the whole planet. I know I'm very fortunate that where we live, we have access to fresh, local, seasonal whole food. There are vast tracts of society that don't have access to, complete proteins, complete healthy fats, and that becomes part of a social dilemma.
It is definitely part of the discussion, and it relates to the last question I want to ask you, Dr. Gary Fettke, which is that, there's a big part of the world here in Africa or in Asia who are sort of entering the global middle class. And as such, in India, when I used to live in India, it was, Pizza Hut and McDonald's were sort of status symbols. Like when you started eating there, you had changed your sort of class status, and you were no longer, poor, basically. Now you've entered the middle class. So what would you say to an individual who is faced with these choices? At the same time, those same people I'm talking about, they could have chosen to continue to eat like their parents and their grandparents, which may not have been an ideal diet, but it wasn't, processed pizzas and Coca-Cola. So what would you say to someone who's looking at the Western way of eating, but also considering their traditional way of eating? What would you say to such a person?
If it's cheap and nasty, it's going to be cheap and nasty long term. I say that it's expensive in time to eat fresh, local, seasonal. It's not necessarily more expensive in money. It takes time and effort to actually go out and shop for your fresh produce and cook in a traditional family sense where everyone is involved in it. That takes time, and a lot of people say they don't have time to do that, so they do go along and have that fast food. But I've said over and over, if you've got a choice of spending that time preparing your food now, buying the best quality food that you can afford, which is fresh, local, seasonal, then you've got a choice of spending that time now, or you've got a choice of spending that time in my waiting room in the long term. Because there is going to be a metabolic price, there's going to be a health cost associated with poor eating. We pay more attention to what fuel we put in our cars than we do to what fuel we put in our bodies. And you've only got one chance. You've only got one life. Put the best possible food that you can get access to with the right information that's out there. And I'm concerned that there's so much disinformation, I call it deliberate misinformation, that's out in society, which is taking away a very simple health message that I'm giving. I come back to that, what's contentious with what I've said, an ancestral way of eating, fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That empowers the individual, disempowers the corporates, it decentralises buying power, it puts it back to the local farmer, the local community. But it's not good for the corporates. And that's why I get into trouble. That's why I got into trouble. Because biochemically, I haven't lost an argument, I haven't lost a debate on this. We come down to the biochemistry of glucose and fructose and seed oils. We come down to the biochemistry of inflammation. It's a complete no-brainer. So I'm very happy for people to have their opinion, and I actually quite like, I want people to have an opinion, form an opinion. But then I try and work out how they've actually come to that opinion. And if I disagree with it, I may learn something by actually challenging that. And that's certainly all I've done. I've just poked these houses of cards, which is nutrition, and they just keep collapsing all over the place. And when you go back, they're actually not based on science, they're based on opinion, they're based on money, or unfortunately, they're based on a religious ideology by a small group, but a very small and powerful group who have infiltrated right across Western cultures and now actually trying to get across the entire world. Not based on health or well-being, even though they might believe in it, but based on a product. So Christ can return. I mean, I can't actually make this up. And this works actually. If you go to the Seventh-day Adventist literature, where they've published this, and they've actually put Belinda's work is in the references. They're actually very proud of it. They're very proud of what they're doing. They don't hide it. It's about getting that health reform message out there to the population.
Yeah. Well, we have to be equally vocal and equally stringent in trying to get our message out. So, Dr. Gary Fettke, it's been a real honor and a pleasure. Dr. Gary Fettke, one of the few surgeons who wants surgery to not happen, doesn't want you on his table. It's been a real pleasure, sir, and I hope we can do this again.
All right, Samir, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Dr. Gary Fettke. If you like this content, please do remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review. You can also check out my website, samirdasani.net, for more content like this. With that, I'm Samir. I'm a health coach and a PhD student based in Johannesburg. I'll see you next time.